Welcome to the show. I'm your co-host, Carla, and welcome to episode 1. Today, we're introducing ourselves to you, our audience, and what this podcast is about. So I'd like to first introduce our co-host, Giana, down there with the lovely orange hair, and our other co-host, Glenn Wright, who happens to be my father as well. So thank you so much for joining us today, guys. And I'd like to start off with Giana by telling us a little bit more about yourself. So if you could just tell us your background in politics, why you wanted to do this podcast, and what do you hope to learn from it?
Thanks, Carla. My name is Giana Petrichella, and I'm super excited to be part of this podcast and introduce myself to everyone listening in. I have zero background in politics. I actually didn't show very much interest, as most of our viewers and listeners probably share that commonality. Just growing up in the world, I was raised by a single mom. We're told to go to school, go to college, move on to a career. And the topic of politics, doesn't really come into play, I don't think, unless you're part of the education system. And that is even questionable, right? I mean, in this day and age, in the world we live in, there are many states that treat our education system wildly different from one another. So my interest in politics didn't really come to fruition until I was older. I had the pleasure of working in an education space in my career and was able to see and have really clear insight into how our K through 12 public school system works. We have so many fantastic educators out there in the world, and as we all know, and I think we can all agree on, they are some of the most undervalued and underpaid resources that we have in this country. And that's really where my journey begins. I would say it was probably a more subconscious journey into politics. And then, of course, I've had the pleasure of becoming a mother and transitioning from the education space into the tech and SaaS world. I also went to college. I was a pre-business law major, majored in business management and legal studies at Cal State Fullerton University. I'm originally from Southern California. And shortly after graduation, I had the opportunity to start my career here in Utah. And I had never visited the state prior to moving. And I grew very accustomed very quickly to Utah politics and culture. And I think that, combined with my career in education, really was the peak of my subconscious interest in politics. So I'm super excited to bring my point of view and my background into this conversation for future episodes to come. I just really hope that what we can do is tap into an audience that is just really interested in learning the basics of politics, understanding the framework of politics, how our country is, organized, and foundationally how we function in the system. And hopefully educate folks along the way. I think it's really important that we kind of go back to our roots. So many of us went to school, high school, and college, and that's probably where our politics stopped. Our education in politics probably stopped in high school, most likely, unless you majored as a poli-sci in college and had the opportunity to go to college. So thanks for having me, and I'm really excited to be part of this journey and learn as well, because I don't think we're ever in a position where we'll stop learning, especially as the politics of today's world continues to turn and become so just involved and intense over time.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that. It's definitely a reason why we are starting the podcast, is to kind of educate everybody on, including ourselves, on policies and how they affect everything, and just kind of empowering everybody to be able to speak to this. So great. Thank you so much, Giana. Let's turn our attention to Glenn Wright, aka my dad, to give a little bit of background on himself, why he wanted to do this podcast, and what he hopes to learn from it.
Thank you, Carla. It's a pleasure being with you. And I have to say, I started my political career a lot later in life than where you two are right now. But my background in politics comes from my experience in college and after college as a Vietnam War veteran. I actually entered college in 1965 as the Vietnam War was accelerating. My major was aeronautical engineering. I was an Air Force ROTC, getting good grades. And my first year in college, I passed the flight physical. The Air Force came to me and said, Cadet Wright, how would you like the scholarship? All you got to do is give us 4 years after pilot training. I said, sign me up, which I got through pilot training. And actually, politically, the first event in my political experience probably was when I was arriving at pilot training base. I drove from New York to Valdosta, Georgia, which is as far as southern Georgia near the Florida border. As I'm driving into town, this was in 1969. 4 years after the Public Accommodations Act had been passed by Congress, still saw signs up on the streets in Valdosta, Negroes only, for the bathrooms. They weren't in use, but they never took the signs down. So that was an indication of where we were still as a country at that time. Graduated from pilot training, trained as a forward air controller. And in today's terms, what the drones are doing today, we did in small aircraft right over the battlefield. It was a really great experience in observing the war because we were in charge of the local air war, but in close contact with people on the ground. Talk to them on the radio, regularly to put in airstrikes. 4 or 5 months into my first tour, in early 1971, I was flying missions in support of the South Vietnamese Army as they invaded Laos. And what I found out then was that the war was lost. The North Vietnamese were much more motivated to win the war than our South Vietnamese allies. And we were indeed starting to pull down our troops. But from that particular point in the war, there was still 20,000 more Americans were going to die, and hundreds of thousands of Southeast Asians. I flew a second tour in 73, and I got there just as a ceasefire in Vietnam was occurring. So our ground troops were being pulled completely out of the war by that time. But we still had about 6 months of flying close air support missions for the Cambodian army. Congress passed a bombing halt, and on August 14th, we ceased helping the Cambodian army. I was the second last combat airplane out of Cambodia on that day. And as I'm flying out of the country, I'm looking down on rice paddies and rubber plantations. And I'm thinking to myself, well, the guy on the ground, he probably isn't going to care who's in charge in Phnom Penh. And it turns out I was very wrong. Our squadron of forward air controllers and 3 wings of Air Force fighters in Thailand probably could have prevented the killing fields. So I have 2 completely different views of war from that standpoint. In most of my life, I was not politically motivated. I became politically motivated in 2003 when the Iraq War started. I had been in one unsuccessful war that killed hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of people, and I thought this was going to be another one. So I became a political activist at that time. In 2003, I lived in Florida, and I supported Wesley Clark, who was a former NATO commander. I actually had him in our house in, I think it was around September of 2003, October 2003. And I was talking to him, and he said his motivation was he had just retired as NATO commander days before 9/11. And he was hired by CNN as a talking head to talk about the military affairs. So he immediately after 9/11 went to the Pentagon, started talking to his old 4-star general and admiral buddies, and they told him an amazing story. The story was, you know what these guys are doing? They're using 9/11 as an excuse to start a war in Iraq. So that motivated him to run for president and motivated me to work in his campaign. Broward County, where we lived, was a very Democratic county. And at that time, I was told had 67 Democratic clubs in the county. And my job was to go out and talk to as many of them as I could to try to generate votes for him in the Florida primary. I actually spoke to about 30 of the Democratic clubs in the next 4 or 5 months. Unfortunately, he didn't get enough votes in the early primaries and dropped out of the race before he got to Florida. I wound up in the general election supporting John Kerry. I knocked on every door in my precinct in support of his campaign. Then I retired in 2005, moved to Florida. I moved here to Utah in 2006. And one of the first things I observed was how the teachers organized to defeat vouchers in an initiative. They actually collected enough signatures to get an initiative on the ballot to overturn a decision by the legislature that put vouchers in place for public education. And I was motivated by that, by the gerrymandering that was going on. And I helped organize a field campaign called Fair Boundaries, which was trying to get an initiative on in 2010 to prevent gerrymandering. We were not successful. We didn't have much financial support. We did strictly with volunteers, and we didn't get enough signatures. But even with volunteers and with no financial backing, we collected about 50,000 signatures around the state. So I worked for Fair Boundaries in 2008 and 2009. At the same time, I also got involved in local politics in Summit County, and I became the county Democratic chair in 2009, from 2009 to 2017. At the time I took over as Democratic chair, the county council was 4 Democrats and 1 Republican, and the 7 elected officials in the county were 3 Democrats and 4 Republicans. By the time I ran for the county council myself in 2016, I defeated the last Republican in countywide office in Summit County. We won our races by about a 53-47 margin that year. By 2020, Biden won the county 58-42. So we made some pretty good progress there. During that time, I also spent 6 years on the state Democratic Executive Committee. I ran for the legislature twice, in 2010 and 2014, for county council in 2016 and 18, and I ran for Congressional District 3 last year. And that's pretty much my political background. Why do I want to do this podcast? Because essentially I'm a policy geek. I like to talk about issues. Politics should be issue-related, not personalities. What we want to do is bring together experts to frame these issues. Our country is facing many serious issues right now: climate change, threats to the Constitution and our democratic elected republic, abortion, women's rights, minority and LGBTQ rights, book banning, national debt, deficit issues, and foreign policy. What do we hope to learn? Hope to get some really knowledge experts in these fields to enlighten us and develop the policies we need to lead the country.
Great. That, you touched on a couple subjects there that I think our viewers may have questions about. So I just want to reassure them that we will be coming back to those topics, such as, what are the primaries and how do they work? When are they? Why are they important? As well as gerrymandering and fair boundaries, just because those are local issues and national issues, but they affect everybody differently depending on that. So we will get into both of those topics into another episode. And as for myself, my background in politics really started with working with my dad's campaign as he was running for county council back in, what was it, 2014? 2012? 2016? I think there was another one before that too. I think there was one in 2012 when I was in Florida. I don't remember.
10.
Okay. We have bad memories. So somewhere around those.
Legislative race in 2010.
Okay. Yeah. We'll go back to 2010. So
and 2014, both.
Yes, that's true. So my background started because my dad asked me for help because I have a bachelor's degree in public communication with an emphasis in writing and rhetoric. So my whole 4 years, at least for that degree, pertained to persuasion and propaganda and basically dissecting a lot of the oral history that goes into presidential speeches, how it motivates people, what white propaganda is, black propaganda, what gray propaganda is, how it works, how it uses ethos, pathos, and logos to affect people's decisions, why we become biased in the first place, and just overall communication and how you can, for lack of a better word, manipulate people to kind of listen to messaging. So that's where one of my degrees is in. So I came in kind of brand new, trying to help him with his campaign, just coming off of, learning the persuasion and propaganda that goes into speeches, that goes into the rhetoric that you hear in political campaigns. A lot of it is gray and black propaganda. It's meant to scare you. It's some of it's warmongering, which we can get into in another day, scaremongering type of things. So I really wanted to learn more as I helped my dad with politics, because just like Giana, I came from a place of, I know what I know and I don't know. And I know what I don't know. I know there's three branches of the legislate of the, well, what is it? Three branches of
government.
Government. There you go. There's the word. There's three branches
Executive,
of government.
legislative, and judicial.
This is the way we're doing the podcast. There's three branches of the government.
They're just like you. We forget things.
We forget, yes. And that's why it's important, because you shouldn't be ashamed that you don't know what you don't know. That's why we're doing this. So again, it's just to kind of get into that a little bit more of just coming from a place of not knowing, learning as we go along the way. And I feel like this has helped me help my dad with his campaigns. As he learns more, I learn more, because I have to ask questions in order to understand and in order to develop messaging for how he wants to, as we say in marketing, go to market when he markets his campaigns. So my background in politics is somewhere in between my dad's and Giana's. I feel like when I speak to people, they feel like I know a lot, but half the time I'm just mimicking what I heard and I don't fully understand it. So that's where we're getting to with this podcast, is where I wanted to do this to kind of educate people like myself and people like Giana, and even bringing these subject matter experts that can even talk policy nerd with my dad. And we're just here to eat our popcorn and cheer them along and just kind of understand more about how politics works in the United States of America and how we can basically become more involved at the community level and how that affects everything. So what I do hope to learn from this is, just more policy moving forward, and hopefully just, encourage people to go out and, become candidates themselves for whatever county government, state that they want to run in, and we have better candidates moving forward in politics to vote for. So what this podcast will cover is economic topics, climate topics, foreign policy topics, social topics, and local topics that we touched on before, such as gerrymandering, fair boundaries, what are the primaries, when are they, type of thing. So our mission for this podcast is to learn and educate ourselves and our audience on political topics covered in executive, judicial, and legislative. God. Legislative. Thank you. Legislative branch elections by working with leading subject matter experts in these topics and ask them the burning questions we all have when it comes to politics. So we do want this to be unbiased. We do want it to be educational. We will not be inserting our opinion unless we are having an actual debate. So this is to educate and learn for anybody who is listening to this. So our vision is to empower people to have civil discussions without the mudslinging and ad hominem attacks that we are so used to hearing now in politics, especially during debates. So that is us, Carla, Glenn, and Giana, and we are happy to be doing this podcast. Hope that everybody learned something from it. Dad, do you have anything to add?
I think you have summed it up admirably.
Giana, do you have anything?
I plus that comment.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for listening, everybody, and we look forward to you listening to our episode 2.
Thanks, everyone.